Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am Sarah Angel, the founder and the executive director of the Art Canada Institute. Thank you so much for joining me tonight to learn more about one of the country's most extraordinary artists, Pitseolak Ashoona. In the 1970s, Pitseolak Ashoona was a world-famous art star, and she was pretty much as close to a Canadian, as a Canadian artist could get to being a household name. In 1973, the National Film Board of Canada released Pictures Out of My Life, based on Pitseolak's autobiography. It premiered at the National Arts Centre, where Jean Chrétien, then Minister of Indian Affairs, opened the event. And here he is, shown standing beside Pitseolak Ashoona. A year later, in 1974, Pitseolak Ashoona was inducted into the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts. Not long after, a retrospective exhibition of her art toured Canada before opening at several US venues, including Washington's Smithsonian Institute. By the end of the 70s, Pitseolak had received the Order of Canada for her influence on Canadian visual arts and heritage. Her influence involved nothing less than really giving birth to modern Inuit art. It was that contribution, as you will learn tonight, that was fundamental in putting Cape Dorset on the map as a center of Canadian visual culture. And it was an honor that Pitseolak received for becoming an inspiration to countless Inuit artists who followed in her wake, among them Annie Putagut, who won the 2007 Sobey Art Prize. Now, yet despite this tremendous impact and influence that Pitseolak had in the 1970s, most Canadians who were not old enough to witness her accomplishments firsthand had never actually heard of her or got to know her as a household name. Although I studied Canadian art history at an undergraduate level, at a master's level, and at a PhD level, amazingly, I actually had never heard her name in any Canadian art course that I was taught. I know, it's kind of shocking and a bit embarrassing, and for that matter, I had actually never even known who Pitseolak Ashoona was until Christine Lalonde proposed to me that she write a book on her. And it really is for this reason that the Art Canada Institute feels so privileged and proud to publish Pitseolak Ashoona, Life and Work by Christine Lalonde, and to have Christine with us here tonight. Her book went live this morning in 6 formats. Thanks to Christine's excellent digital volume, Pitseolak's art will be remembered, it will be studied, and it will be applauded for decades to come, as it should be. Christine Lalonde is Curator of Indigenous Art at the National Gallery of Canada. Her many exhibition projects have advanced an appreciation for Inuit artists across the country and have reached new international audiences, including the critically acclaimed exhibition Sakakan, in which she played an instrumental role in bringing international Indigenous art into a dynamic and thought-provoking conversation. Christine is a widely published author, and she is chair of the editorial board for the magazine Inuit Art Quarterly. And as well, it is my privilege to have with us Anna Hudson, who is an art historian, a curator, a writer, and an educator specializing in Canadian art and visual culture, and she does teach Inuit art in her classes. By the way, I haven't taken a class with Anna. As well, she is a professor and an associate dean at York University, and she is currently leading a major social sciences and humanities research council project titled Mobilizing Inuit Cultural Heritage. Anna's curatorial credits include the much celebrated show Painting Canada, Tom Thompson and the Group of Seven. Anna also plays a fundamental role at the Art Canada Institute, where we are so lucky to have her as our commissioning editor. So I'd like you to please join me in welcoming Anna and Christine, and we will begin our discussion. I think, Christine, I'd really love to start this conversation by hearing about how you became interested in Pitseolak Ashoona. I know that your interest in her goes quite a ways back. And, put simply, how did it come to pass?
The mic.
I'm going to give this to you.
Thank you. And actually, I'll just start off by saying it's true that Pitseolak Ashoona is a very key figure in the world of Inuit art, but it's in recent years has maybe become less known, or if known, it's usually as the grandmother of Annie Putugu and Shibanai Ashoona, among other artists, Kuta Ashoona. And while that is really important because she was very influential on a number, like generations of artists, it's not the same as recognizing her for her own accomplishments. So I'm very happy when Anna invited me to join this incredibly innovative series that I was able to use and revisit my MA thesis, which I thought would never get published. and I'm really pleased that I waited this long in order to see it in this format, because it's really quite beautiful. And I also would like to thank all of the ACI team, because they really were a dream to work with, and I think they deserve a round of applause as well. Pitseolak, in fact, has made one of the most famous quotes in saying that she recognized she had had a remarkable life, being born in a skin tent and living to hear that 2 men had landed on the moon. And it's true, this is a very eloquent way of summing up all of the radical change that her generation went through as they moved off the land and settled into communities. Besides sharing that with others of her generation, she also did have a very dramatic and intense personal life. And we're fortunate to know about this because she was one of the first to actually tell her own story in her own words, which were published in Pictures Out of My Life. Canada rocks. I'm just going to use my notes for this first one because if I start talking, I could never get off this slide. Perhaps it's more dangerous what I remember than what I forget. I really admired Pitseolak when I started working on my MA thesis, that she remained creative, optimistic, and faced adversity with such rigor and never losing sight of what was important to her, which was helping her family. She had a remarkable life in that she was born between 1904 and 1908. And again, her life is, her birth, the story of her birth really does epitomize what would be called a nomadic or a semi-nomadic lifestyle that Inuit had at the turn of the century still. So she was actually born as her family were moving across from Nunavik, so we can see Saluit at the bottom of the map. And she was born on the island in between as they were traversing to move to Qikiqtaaluk, or Baffin Island in Nunavut today. And that didn't stop. She actually traveled with her family all along the coastline, all the way up to Iqaluit, and perhaps even as far as Pangnirtung. And during her lifetime with her husband Ashoona, they would camp at all of these different locations, and even as far as Nitling Lake, which we see up in the top. And this is really quite extraordinary if you think about it. For Pitseolak and her family, home was this immense expanse of land and sea. And then later in her life, she moved to living in one community, one small community, Cape Dorset. And of course, this experience shaped her. She became an artist as a mature woman, and she drew upon those memories, that familiarity of the land and the waters from having walked over it step by step, having spent days in one location, moving to another location. And it appears in her work in two very interesting ways. Of course, her subject matter, drawing upon her memories of that time, but her work, one very strong characteristic is this interest in movement, and it gives an energy to her artwork that she drew upon. Of course, her family lived a very traditional, what we would call a traditional camp life, where basically everything they needed in order to survive the different seasons, they had to be able to produce and make themselves, from the shelters to the clothing to the hunting implements to the cooking and eating implements. And this was often sometimes in a camp that could have an extended family and other people of 50 to 80 people, or other times it could just be the immediate family of between 7 and 10. So there was great variety in terms of the compositions of the camp life as well. And then, of course, there were people visiting the Arctic at that time, and it's these two very rare photographs that show Pitseolak and her brother and their camp were taken while they were spending the winter outside of the ship, the Boden, which was stuck in the ice. And their relationship with the visitors to the Arctic was a friendly one and seemed to be positive, in that Pitseolak has very good memories that she writes about of watching her first movies on board the ship, and being able to work with people who had come from afar, learn things. Her father was very much a part of helping the crew of the Bowden acclimatize to the winter that they stayed over. And of course, again, this experience of living on the land is very much what she drew about when she became an artist. And these are two views just to show that another level of transition and change that Pitseolak survived with good cheer was moving into Cape Dorset in the early 1960s. And so we have a photograph of the very beginning of the community as we know it today, and another photograph from 1979, just a few years before she would have passed away. And how I came to first discover Pitseolak, although I did know of her beforehand, was I was fortunate to be a student at the National Gallery of Canada. I had actually been working in the photographs collection, and I started taking a class on Inuit art with Dr. Mame Jackson. And when Marie Rutledge, who is the first curator of Inuit art at the National Gallery, heard that I was taking a course, she stole me away. And one of my first summer jobs was to actually go through a collection, a transferred collection that had come to the gallery, and do reconfirm where the works were and their location, which was a joy. I got to see everything. And I do remember to this day opening that drawer and seeing these drawings. And I'm in a gray vault with, track lighting, and these drawings were like jewels. They glowed. I was so surprised. I thought, wow, who are these by? So I went to see Marie, and she said, oh, those must be by Pitseolak Ashoona. And I was surprised because we had studied her work in class, the prints, but I had never anticipated the amount of color and the liveliness of her drawings. And then Marie kindly also told me that all of her drawings were being housed at the McMichael, and there would probably be about 6,000 of them. So I thought, this is fodder for an MA thesis. So I continued. I went to the McMichael. I spent 3 weeks going through the drawings there. I looked at about 4,000, and I still didn't come halfway to the over 9,000 drawings that she created in her lifetime as an artist. I also went to Cape Dorset, and I suffered incredible culture shock. And in fact, I had been in Iqaluit, and I was there for 4 days, and all I could do by that point was walk around the community and the surrounding landscape. And then I realized that, in fact, that was the most important thing I could have done, because in walking around the same places that Pitseolak walked, I understood her as an artist, and I understood what she was attempting to do in her drawings in terms of drawing the landscape and all its changing seasons. Fortunately for me, the year after I finished my MA thesis, I was able to do an exhibition of Pitseolak Ashoona at the National Gallery of Canada. And so my first exhibition at the National Gallery of Canada was Pitseolak Ashoona. At that time, though, Pitseolak had passed away, and I had her wonderful autobiography to tell me many details of her life. It was also due to people like Dorothy Eber and Terry Ryan, who was in Cape Dorset from the early 1960s up into just recently and knew Pitseolak very well. For them to talk to me made me feel like I understood her a little bit better and was getting to know her. But it was really this past summer when I went to Cape Dorset for 3 weeks that Pitseolak became a person for me. And that was really thanks to the Ashoona family. And everyone who heard that I was working on this book for ACI would tell me stories about Pitseolak. And these are just two sort of snaps from interviews that I was able to do with Pitseolak Ashoona, her daughter-in-law, with Mary Ashoona Curley and Ashoona, and Kyoga Ashoona and Jimmy Manning, and especially with Jimmy Manning, who came to me with the idea that wouldn't it be great to ask Kyoga where all those camps were that Pitseolak and Ashoona had raised them. And so we sat down and were able to go over a map and find those locations, and in the names that he knew them as. And Shuvani Ashoona was also really supportive, and here she is looking over the immense Ashoona family tree.
I want to ask a very simple question to you, Anna. And as somebody who's been teaching in universities about Inuit art, one thing that I'm really curious about is we hear about other Inuit artists, but what is it that makes Pitseolak Ashoona so important to the history of Canadian art and to Canadian history as well?
It's a great question, and every time I come back to it, I come back with a slightly different answer or another answer. I think one of the first things that I would say is it's her legacy, and we have a living legacy in the room. When you read the book, you'll read that Pitseolak lived for many years with her son Kumuatak, and we have Kumuatak's namesake, Kumuatak Curley. Come on, Kuzi, you got to put your hand up. So Kuzi works with me on the grant, and thank you very much for being here. So there's this tremendous family legacy. So there's this inspiration. But you know, it's interesting because it's a collision of worlds. So she grows up at an incredibly colonial time. Not to suggest that we've shed that mantle quite, but you know, she grows up at a time when the North Canadian Arctic was part of the Geological Survey, then part of mines and natural resources, and then part of Indian affairs and national resources, and then finally Aboriginal affairs and northern development. So she goes through that whole, really sees that whole long trajectory, and it's one in which, of course, Inuit didn't have much of a voice in what was happening to the land that was historically theirs. At the same time, though, in the midst of that is the feminist movement, and in the 70s, that trajectory hits her, and she flies with it. She does the Pictures Out of My Life in '71, and it's very similar to women's art or feminist art of that time, where the personal is political and where you tell about what's happening in your daily life, and that really matters. So here we have an Indigenous woman doing the same thing, and she comes quickly to acclaim. And becomes a member of the Royal Society of Canada. She has an exhibition, and that exhibition ends up touring until 1977 and going to the U.S. So it's really extraordinary. But I should add one more point there, that during this time, then, we see that art in the North, art in the Arctic, becomes an incredibly important economic driver. And it was in the previous slide, Sarah, I apologize, where we see on the left hand James and Alma Houston. And probably many of you know that story, but James Houston was an airman and had traveled to the North during the war. He was also an artist. And he realized that this was it was sort of like, I guess, a great community art project as it started. And he and his wife really helped instigate the creation of an art market in the North, which remains for Nunavut 20% of the economy. And I'd like to do another shout out, shameless, to Ollie at the back there, Ollie Hirji, who works also on the grant. And we're just fascinated by, how important it is to think about the number of artists in communities who are driving that economy separately from mining and natural resource development.
And what year did James and Alma Houston go to Cape Dorset, and what was the impetus behind the thinking, and how long did they stay there? Because they really fueled a lot of modern.
Yes,
Inuit
they
art.
did, and I'm sure Christine will want to weigh on this too. So this is immediately post-war.
Okay.
So it's right in that post-war moment. So there's communities are becoming solidified. People are coming into sedentary, essentially, life, and picking up artwork, selling it through the Canadian Handicrafts Guild. Really was sort of behind it all. It was like this sort of 1930s, 1940s wartime art and society. Canadian national art is a political driver behind that. But they stay there for many years, and then the cooperatives are created. And then we see on the right a handsome Terry Ryan there in the back, who helps mentor community artists to develop their skills, creates the printmaking, helps market it to the world essentially, and that's still very much continuing today. Yes, of all the cooperatives, really, it's the one in Cape Dorset that thrives. But as we will hear more on that from Christine. Yeah. I have a question, though.
Okay.
If I can ask Christine. So at the time when Pitseolak first becomes well known, there's not a lot of understanding generally in Canada about Inuit art. I think the sentiment probably was, Inuit artists are not portraying their own lives. There's some sort of maybe it's all legends, or how does she break the stereotype and sort of come through to be recognized as a really individual, independent, original artist?
Well, it's true. When Inuit art first appeared, there was probably a recognition that, of course, the people creating the artworks were drawing upon their own experiences and their own knowledge. But I think it was more wrapped up in this idea of a collective identity, that they were simply just drawing Inuit doing this and Inuit living this way. Pitseolak broke this, especially when when her autobiography was published, because it was the first time, and in fact, I think it was really the first time that an Inuit artist had been interviewed at length by Dorothy Eber, and it was one of the first occasions where in print people could actually hear a person talk about their own experiences and see that while there were commonalities, everyone was different. So she really did counter that perception of Inuit as a homogeneous society, and that they all did have very individual experiences, and that, in fact, they did draw them too.
And just to clarify that, so is what you're saying that prior to her, the depiction of Inuit art would be of symbols or common themes in the community, and that she started then advancing a personal narrative?
Well, I've been tracking this about 13 years, especially since I worked with Pitseolak, and I believe now that there were more first-generation artists who were doing very specific events from their life and very specific people, but because of a lack of communication, because of the distance, and also perhaps because they weren't really even encouraged to do that. For a variety of reasons, they weren't identifying those works as being specific.
I see. So, but really then the book, where she was offering her own personal narrative, connected it to her art.
Yes, and it was a breakthrough. And it if it had been there, perhaps for some artists beforehand, after Pitseolak, it definitely became something that people now recognize that they had to look through simply just a veil that said this is Inuit culture, to that these were personal experiences that were being depicted, whether they were identified as that or not.
Can you tell us about some of those, her personal experiences? I'm really curious.
This is a portrait of her husband, Ashoona, and while you can see there's nothing there to identify that it is Ashoona, we know that she did identify that she had drawn him, and one of her sons, Namunai, also. And it's very similar to a portrait that had been taken by Dewey Soper, who Ashoona had worked with. But this would be the sort of scene that people would say, oh, this is a very beautiful drawing of the way Inuit lived in the past in the north. And in fact, it's a very specific drawing of her experiences of being up in Natsalik, and the camp that her and Ashoona went to, more so than any other family. But she doesn't identify any of the individuals. She doesn't really present this as, this is us, or this happened to me. It's more, this happened to us. However, this was in fact one work that I think gives a good example of how understanding of autobiography can be misunderstood in different within different societies, so that the way that Pitseolak represented herself and her family was quite different than the way an artist would have been from the Western world. So this, in fact, was done in 66 and 68, sometime between then. It was made into a print and became quite a well-known, beautiful print. However, no one ever really knew the actual subject matter until a few years later when Dorothy Eber asked Pitseolak about it. And in fact, it is a drawing of her father, Otoki, building an Inukshuk, and a very specific Inukshuk. It was one that was built around 1912 when her family first moved back to the Cape Dorset area and the Hudson Bay post had been built. So they built this Inukshuk just outside of town where hunters would stay all night long when they were expecting the Hudson's Bay Company ship to arrive. And so it works in both ways. For Pitseolak, it was a very personal drawing of her remembering her father building this while she probably played in the vicinity. But it also tells, it's a very accurate depiction of a way an Inukshuk would be built, how the people would be positioned, handing things to each other. It's her way of saying to an outside audience that Inuit made Inukshuk for a variety of reasons, and it's also a way for herself to go back to those memories. So it's both personal and cultural without there being any contradiction or dichotomy. And I think the same can be said in drawings that are often of legends, or of the oral tradition. That even when someone was telling a story or depicting it, that their personal experiences would come into play, and that the stories could even then be a metaphor for something they were experiencing and didn't have another means to express it. This is a story of a woman who turns into a narwhal. It's a beautiful long story. I'll make it very short because we do have Pitseolak's beautiful drawing. A woman was being beaten by her husband, and one day when he came back from hunting, she could not face another beating, so she ran to the cliff edge and jumped over into the water. But instead of dying, she was transformed into a narwhal with her long braid, which you see in the upper register, turning into the tusk of the narwhal. And we know from her daughter, Napachi, that Pitseolak and other women of her generation, this was a reality that they faced. And yet, in all of the drawings that Pitseolak did, she never dwelled on the negative side of life. She really, both for her personality and also, I think, for what she wanted to be remembered, she dwelled on the best side of the life that she had experienced.
Christine, can you tell us a bit about her personal life? I mean, is it true she had 10 children?
17.
Oh my goodness. So 17 children, And my understanding, it was she had a fairly traditional life. Like she was taking care of the kids while her husband was out hunting, and that she actually, as you just mentioned, suffered from spousal abuse. I don't know if that would be the correct term to use, but it was a part of the culture. So her life was certainly not easy. And how did she have time to make art with? Did all 17 children live?
No, as she tells it, she had 17 children, one for each year of her marriage with Ashoona. And I mean, I really respect Pitseolak's not ever drawing any of those difficult times, and also not talking to outsiders about them. We only know about them from Napachi speaking about them. I think that was something that happened. We don't know all of the difficulties, what were the circumstances behind them that maybe even a younger Napachi might have interpreted. But she, it was a laborious life. I mean, she, with the children that she did have, and often many of them were either died in infancy because it was very difficult at times to get beyond the first or second year. And also others were adopted out to other families, which was customary, especially if other families did not have children or grandparents did not have children to help them out. She had 6 remaining children at the time of Ashoona's death, and those were the ones that she moved to the community with. But yes, she had to take care of them, be considerate of their wealth and their health and well-being. She had to prepare the shelter for the whole family, all of the clothing, 2 layers of clothing. And she didn't become an artist until after that side of her life was behind her.
Until the kids were grown up, or until her?
Yes. So after the death of Ashoona, the family went through about a decade of very difficult times where they survived by being able to rely on relatives who would help them out and take care of them. Napachi accounts that one time the family, the children actually had to live with separate relatives. But gradually the sons did grow up. They became better and better hunters. They were able to bring skins, and the family would be reunited. The sons married, and as was customary, Pitseolak went to live with some of her sons and even her daughter's family. And then after the war, as Anna explained, with the collapse of the fur trade and the growing interest on the government in the north, they moved off the land into the communities. And there, Pitseolak no longer had to do all of those tasks that she had throughout her life, but she had to find a new way to be useful, to support her family and herself, and becoming an artist offered that to her.
Can you tell us, so how did she find art? Like was she trained in any kind of formal way?
No. In terms of the autobiography, Pitseolak laid the groundwork for generations of artists in her traditional scenes. She created the visual vocabulary, but she also opened the door for new directions that are in fact still being followed very much today. In that autobiography and personal narratives is one of the most exciting trends in Inuit art today. But to go back to how she actually became an artist, she taught herself, and she did it. This was one of the things I admired when I looked through those 4,000 drawings. That was a discovery, because some of them were half finished, some of them were just attempts, and she taught herself to draw. She worked with determination and dedication, drawing the same thing over and over again until she mastered what was important to her, such as depicting the land, so that we see a very early drawing, one that's slightly layer, and how she's starting to draw registers in order to show movement of people through the land, to her later drawings, where she actually has mastered the way to show the hilliness around Cape Dorset, which Inukshuk name is Kingite, and then even to show that emotional and expressive connection with the land and how her family lived within it.
I want to ask something to Anna, and you mentioned earlier that in many ways Pitseolak became a feminist icon, and I certainly know that Joyce Wieland was so taken by her work, and she was such an inspiration. And something that has really interested me about Christine's book is, Christine, you write about how that Pitseolak had a certain sort of freedom to be an artist that as a woman, although she faced definitely some very patriarchal structures within her society, as a woman she was very free as an artist to do what she wanted to. And as well, commercially, within galleries south of Dorset, she also had an acceptance where nobody was looking at her like, this is a female artist and this is a male artist. And what accounts for that?
Well, the point that I would just reiterate is that she was making money for the family. So by making art and selling the art, she was supporting herself and her children. So there was a drive there, and I think that the way that the art market evolved, there was a welcoming of community members to participate, no matter what gender. So.
And for the audience in the 70s at that time, many of them wouldn't have been able to recognize in fact, the Inuktitut names are not gender
specific.
Really? So people would have admired the artwork for itself, not knowing the gender of the creator necessarily. And because it was a new activity, it fell outside of those traditional camp-based gender-related tasks, like hunting for men and sewing for women. So it offered her liberty in that sense.
I was just thinking about the earlier slide with John and Alma Houston again, and that women in the craft world in Canada, or women volunteers, in the museum world, there were connections made, I think, for example, between Pitseolak and Alma. And it just makes me think about her doing clothing, selling clothing, or doing fur designs. But then she also was using graphite, felt tip pen. She also did great prints. Do you see a relationship between the work in different media?
Yes, in fact, I mean, I think that much as Pitseolak taught herself to draw, she drew upon the skills that she had. So first of all, sewing, and that ability to sew skins together was translated into doing pictorial art. So we have this very early example by a Pitseolak from a same camp that Pitseolak lived at. So I do feel that it's quite possible it's by her.
And that would be like a sealskin kind of badge?
It was, who knows what it was? It was probably something they were experimenting with, but the imagery is very much...
But it's sewn.
Yes, and it's an applique. So it's two types of animal skins, dark and light, following the idea of the clothing too, which was always dark and light patterning. And that sewing of clothing and the design of it and the patterning, the proportion, were all things that helped her when she started drawing the figures. With Alma, she took that sewing skill first. That was her first, foray into making pictorial images. Would have been not only making the parkas and the mitts, but also embroidering them. And then we're very lucky to have this example, a very rare example of embroidery work by Pitseolak, which is the closest that we see to her two-dimensional work. So that with her early drawings, you can see how she's figuring out how to use depict things three-dimensional in a two-dimensional plane, but really relying on her dark and light. The line is something that becomes so important to her, and only having graphite for the first few years allowed her to really develop her line. Then moving into color, and you can see on the one side where this was something she did have to figure out. She had to figure out that you can't just use every single color and it becomes a little bit overwhelmed by a later drawing. You can see how she's mastered the ability to use a restrained palette and to really control the media. She also did do printmaking. In fact, as I mentioned, I first knew Pitseolak through her prints. Her drawings were translated into prints, and those are what was largely known to the world. And so we have this beautiful, joyful owl. But it was recognized fairly early on that for artists like Pitseolak, something was lost in the translation to a print. And so we have the print for Inukshuk Builder, which is a very strong graphic image, very beautiful, very beautifully printed. But you can see how there's something that is lost in the translation, particularly for Pitseolak, whose drawing style was so energetic. And because of this, very early on, Terry Ryan decided to try print techniques that would allow the artist to work directly on the plate or the stone. And despite her advanced years at that time, Pitseolak was one of the first to actually start working on copper plates, first engraving with an engraving tool, which she found difficult, and then moving to etching so that she could just use the etching needle. And in 1980, a portfolio of her etchings were published. And even beyond that, when they first decided to start using lithography, Pitseolak was one of the first to participate by drawing directly on the lithographic stone. And in the book, there's a very beautiful description of her by Will Hudson, sitting there singing and thinking about what to draw, and then finally saying, Halona, it's like housework, I have to get to it.
I want to turn to the audience for questions, but before I do, I'd like to ask both of you a question, and I want to know, what is the Pitseolak work? Of all of the thousands of drawings, do you have one, Anna, Christine, that really resonates with you, that you find particularly special?
That's a really tough question, but I've chosen this one on the screen, and it's called The Critic. It's from 1963, and I like it for a couple of reasons. For those of you who know Parr's work, it reminds me of Parr in that there's a real generosity to it. You know, in some of Parr's drawings, it's like he's welcoming you to Inuit Nunat, or Inuit land, and showing you the wealth of that land. What I like this in Pitseolak is she's so showing you how proud she is to be an artist, and she's inviting you into her work. And I think there must be a little plug in there, like, look, I can sell this. You know, you can hunt, but I can sell this. And Christine, you're right. She pays a lot of attention to the fur, the parka design, the Amautic design. So there's everything about her, from what she's wearing to what she's holding, is an exercise in her creativity.
And do you have can you mention a favorite? Is that even a fair question to ask you?
That really was a tough one, but I did choose this one. So we have a woman's face in the center of a yellow sun, or even just a circle surrounded by blue with a bunch of eyes. So it's somewhat literal. I am convinced that this is Pitseolak looking at us. This is a self-portrait, whether it's a literal one or a metaphorical one. And yet as an artist, she's also expressed herself, because she's added these whimsical eyes and set it in this happy, joyful sphere. And to me, that really does sum up Pitseolak as an artist and as a person, what she wanted us to carry away with us from her artwork. And yes, this is at the National Gallery of Canada. And every time I want to see Pitseolak, I can go see this drawing.
Thank you. That was amazing, ladies. And I'd now like to ask the audience if anybody has any questions. Kevin.
Well, a lot of the drawings have extraordinary, almost tropical-looking exotic birds, and you didn't talk about those. Do they exist in the Arctic? Where did they come from?
Well, yes, they do. I mean, Cape Dorset, in fact, is one of the most lush places for birds to come in, especially migrate in the summertime as well. When I mentioned Ashoona worked with Dewey Soper, Soper was, in fact, an ornithologist who went up north to look for the blue nesting grounds of the blue goose, which, in fact, was a subspecies of the Canadian goose. So there's the Dewey Soper Bird Sanctuary on Fox Peninsula, just around Cape Dorset. But it was more than that. For Pitseolak, her name is a bird. And she had said, and it's in the book as well, about how when she sees those birds, she thinks of herself as flying. It's also, I think, it was a good So besides his affinity, I think it was also a good vehicle for her expression. They were she always drew them naturalistically, but she also took them to another extreme. Like she was, the quirkiness of the birds' nature was perfect for her drawing style as well, and the humor that she wanted to convey. I think about half of her drawings were of birds. Yeah, so they were very important to her. Mm-hmm.
Joyce?
I'd like Anna to say something about the critic in that drawing.
Right. I guess we're it.
Go back to it.
It had a very humorous approach, at least from my perspective, and I thought it would be interesting to have yours and Christine's interpretation of this figure and the relationship.
Right, that there's an awareness there, that there's, there's an understanding of what's going on in the transaction of that artwork. There's a worldliness there, and an intelligence there, and a sense of humor, as you say, Joyce. And I think that's something that's really coming out in the work as now is that how humorous she was as an artist, or how much she used humor to highlight her situation and what was going on around her. Would you say that too, Christine?
And Christine, do you know if she was actually kind of taking a shot at art critics with this work? Like, it's interesting because Joyce Whelan did a work called The Critic that is quite similar, where she is absolutely taking a shot at the art critic. And so when I first saw this, I thought, was she aware of that relationship? But she was distanced from the gallery system and the reviews system.
I think she found the humor in the situation. I think she found the humor, and she comments on it, about how, she went from one lifestyle to now everything that she had depended on flimsy pieces of paper. And it's true that the critic there is not as well dressed as the Inuit. And he looks a little agitated and very excited. But I know from things that I heard from the family and from Anne Hansen, who was the translator for Pitseolak when she traveled south, that she was amazed and incredibly grateful at the admiration she received.
She was, so she wasn't mocking.
There's just something that came to mind looking at this drawing is that I translated the book, and of course when I saw the title, The Critic, I turned Le Critic, obviously, and then I found out that actually they didn't translate it as Le Critique, but Le Critiqueur, which means the criticizer. So it's the French, and I was wondering how they came
That's
to
interesting.
that original French translation, because normally, of course, if it's an art critic, we would say Le Critique. So he's actually criticizing as opposed to critiquing.
Being a critic, yeah.
And to being a professional critic. At least that's how the French people who originally gave this work its French title came up with a whole different story behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I haven't gone beyond that, but that gives us, it sheds light on what's going on here.
Yeah. One other interesting thing about this style of work is that Pitseolak did this theme over and over again. Drawings of people holding her drawings, and yet it was never made into a print. In fact, this work was not exhibited until her solo exhibition in the 1970s. But in response to why they may, at that time was when the translation of the title probably happened, is probably just because he looks a little harsh, I'm guessing.
There's a question at the back there.
And I'm just continuing the same conversation about the critic, and it's hard to see from here, but he have a bird in his hand. Yes. So it's also kind of, and pointing out on the picture of hunters, and it's kind of also, he doesn't seem to belong to this community, but at the same time he is also in some ways the one depicted on those drawings, even though he's dressed differently. So it is. I was also curious, and I'm glad we came back to this because it does bring up a lot of I think it has a lot of layers. And
And I do believe that Pitseolak was remarkable in that sense of really seeing the humor of this new way of life and this whole development of Inuit art for an audience that she, at that time, never thought she would meet. But she also understood the peculiarities of the idea of trade and exchange and creating something that her drawings would have been taken to the cooperative, where they would have been priced according to subject matter and how they might relate to being able to make it into a print. So she was very astute, and it's, I think, again, a credit to her intelligence that she was.
All right, well, thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. As I said, now take out your phones, check out the book. Our website, www.aci-iac. This lecture concludes our second season at the Art Canada Institute. We published 6 books this year, and starting in next September, we will publish another 6. Thanks to all of you who have come out. Your support has been incredible. Thank you, Christine, for doing such a brilliant job, and Anna for being with us this evening.